Hey, so welcome back, everybody. I wanted to make this video to go over a few different input options for participants. In the past, we've just been using the keyboard single input instructions. I wanted to change that to talk about looking at keyboard string input as well as mouse input. These inputs obviously have their benefits only if your experiment calls for them. So if you were doing a behavioral experiment and you wanted to see where people click on the screen in an image, if you said what part of this image stands out to you, you'd want to use a mouse location, right? So they could actually type out what stands out to them, but I think them using their mouse to point out, you could have a bunch of points gathered with all your participants. Then eventually what you would do is you could create a heat map from that. With string input, this is really good for open-ended responses where you ask somebody, what do they think about this? What do they remember? You can also look at just specific string responses. So please type the following, whatever, right? To kind of get some sort of instruction or feedback from the participant. So each of these things has their own benefit. So this is really just aimed to show you kind of a barrage of what you can do with that. Obviously, you wouldn't want to implement every single possible input measure within one single experiment. Again, unless for some reason your experiment called for this kind of multitude or battery of inputs. So if you look over here, we're going to be just going through this kind of quickly. What we have, we're going to be looking at keyboard single input. That's when you just are pressing one key to either advance or select an option. Keyboard string input, this is when you're typing out a string. It's usually a usually an open-ended response, so whatever you're thinking at the time. And then you also have the keyboard string input again, where it is an exact match, where you're looking for a specific thing as opposed to an open-ended response. And then lastly, what you do have is you do have this mouse input, where again, you can go on the screen and you can just drag something, or you can click something, and you can make those areas predefined, or you can make it that wherever the person clicks, it'll record that X and Y coordinate, and then you can build something from there afterwards. So we're going to go over all those things. And what I've done is I've just included a few different events here that are here just kind of out of convenience as opposed to necessity. So what you'll see is in the keyboard single input instructions, there are several feedbacks that show events based on what you pressed. And that's just there so you see the routing of it. So you see that when somebody presses this button, you see that, yes, they pressed this button. So most of the instructions and the choices are there either as a mock for what could be a stand-in, or there as what could be an actual feedback. So first thing we'll do is we'll just go over to the experiment participant input. We'll just go over the keyboard single key first. You're going to see there's a lot going on here. Okay, we have a single key, a double key press, a multiple choice key where there's 6 options. In the first option, there's only one input there. That's the single key. In the double choice, there's a D and a J. And in the multiple choice, there's 6 options. Now, each of these, the idea is when you make a response, make your response, make the naming convention for what it's supposed to be, right? So in this case, single key A, I know this, okay, yeah, this is in the single key event. And this is responsive consisting pressing A. One thing to really make sure that you do note is that this is case sensitive. So for some reason, at least in my experience, making this a capital A makes it unusable. So I would say just default to using lowercase. Again, nothing you're doing should really be matter with case at all, unless you were looking at sentence structure, which again, I don't know why you would be doing that here, but the idea is to just use lowercase for this. So single key A, double key is D, and double key is J. And then multiple choice, we go through Q, W, E, R, T, and Y. And then I haven't changed anything in there. The only thing I've done is to just look for if an event designates a single key response as correct. And again, what that means is that if we're using a string input event, if we don't check this off, it might still be looking for a single key. So by doing this, we say that only if I say, hey, this event over here has a response that is going to be a single key, will it allow that to happen? Then the data to save, we don't need the key that they press. We're going to leave it for right now, but we don't actually need this because it'll record the response they've given, but we'll leave that for the moment. Okay, and then kind of just breezing through this again, we know that blocks are connected to trials, which are connected to events. So I'm just going to go through the events for everything in this keyboard single input. We have our instructions going over how to enable keyboard input as a correct response. For each event, press a key that corresponds to the choice you want to make. Press space when you're ready to begin. Then we have for the single key, press A to advance, press D for choice 1, press J for choice 2, and then QWERTY with the corresponding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is a feedback that responds if you press A in the first trial. Same thing for the second event, if you press D, press J, or if you press anything between QWERTY or QWERTY. Now looking at the input, again, this one we don't record the response, there's no need to. This one we record the response and we reset the timer to see how fast the person presses it. Two choices, again, what we do is we record the response and we also reset the timer. We record the response and reset the timer. And then this one, we don't do anything. We just show it for 500 milliseconds and then it goes away. Okay. So what we'll do is then we'll just go through it. And what I've done is because one of the options, particularly the multiple choice one, it does have 6 possibilities, so QWERTY. I've just looped this block 2 times or 3 times, I think, so we can actually just see a few of those options. And again, if you click on the block of it and you go to looping, it'll say no looping, present only once, or now we're going to say present trials in this block twice. But I believe that's on this one. Yep, 4 times. I'm going to make it 3 just so it's a little bit. I'll do 2 actually. This way it's not there forever. Okay, so again, what I'll do is I'll just kind of hit shift, click. So I'm doing just these. Now, one thing to note is the reason that I'm doing the instructions as a different block entirely than the input itself is because this is going to go through these possible choices. And if I leave the instructions, what it might do is it might just keep showing it again and again. So in this option, I have it set to loop twice. And if it loops twice, it's going to show the instructions again. We don't really want that because you don't want anybody to see the instructions twice. There's no real need to. So we'll just do this. Again, we won't save anything for right now and run selected blocks only. So we'll be going over how to enable keyboard input as a correct response. For each event, press the key that corresponds to the choice you want to make. Press space if you're ready to begin. Now, funny enough, this event looks for a key response, but we're not going to actually tell it what it is because we're just going to be pressing space because there's no real key that needs to be pressed here that says no, only advance when you see this. So we press space. Now, if you remember, I had made those instructions where I said only if an event designates this as such. So what I have to do is if you do that, you have to go in here now and create a new response. And we're just going to call this one instruction advance. Now I think it should recognize that that space as being something. So we'll just see if it does. And again, only do these 2. Okay, so it does. So now it's saying press A to advance. Now notice, yes, the A is capitalized, but the response is going to be lowercase. That doesn't really matter. Just for it to work, it needs to be lowercase as far as I can tell. So we press A, I pressed A, perfect. If I press J, it tells me I pressed J. Now we have all these choices. I don't know, I'll press E this time. You pressed E. Press A to advance, press A again. Now we'll press D, and then we'll press Y. Okay, very, very simple. The experiment ends because we only told to run those 2 blocks. So now we'll jump gears, and actually before we jump gears, let me give you a use case for each of these things. All right, so what I'll do is I'll just run this block by itself now. And then say, in this case, press A to advance. This could be something where in an instruction, it could say, when you're ready to begin, press this. That could be there so that you kind of, you limit participants from just pressing whatever they want to get the experiment over with. Now you actually give them a specific key to press. So press A to continue, perfect. Now in this case, with giving them two choices, it could be the case of, let's say you have some sort of paradigm where you're looking at approach avoidant behavior. D could be approach and J could be avoid. D could be left, J could be right. D could be good, J could be bad, right? So anything that has this kind of dual choice, you could be using this type of input for. Now in this case, this six choices, this seems like it'd be only useful or really only makes sense in a kind of scale or Likert scale type situation. So a lot of experiments that we've designed before, that I've designed before, they implement something where we're looking at some sort of scale that measures either affect or anxiety or emotion. And what we do is we have one being not at all, two being kind of, and then however the scale is labeled out there, right? So this would make sense. And again, this would probably have to be a 7-point scale to be accurate at all, or a 5-point scale. But that would be the use for using this kind of multitude. You know, what happened is you could tell Superlab what to code that as. So you would know that, yeah, 3 is this, and so on and so forth. So this is the use cases for the key inputs. Now looking at the string input. What we'll do is we'll go back to the input window itself and actually just take a look at what the string input says. And I have 3 things over here. The first one I have is just anything. And what this says is to ignore case. So if you put the caps lock key on, doesn't matter, whatever it is. And I'm just saying this is anything. So any response is considered correct. Now, this has a tendency to work sometimes and not work sometimes. So we're going to leave this right now as just being anything. And I think by leaving this blank, that's what we're looking for. So we're going to hit OK to this. Specific face, what you'll see in a moment is that we have an ambiguous picture of a vase or face, depending on how you're looking at it. So in this case, the response is going to be face, and I've ignored the case of this. So if you type in capital F-A-C-E, it works, or lowercase F-A-C-E, it'll work, and then specific vase, again, same exact thing. Now it's important that with this specific string, if you wanted to look for, let's say, 10 possible answers, so if I showed a picture of 10 objects and I said, what do you see first? You'd have to say that any response could be correct if they see it. But you'd have to then make enough responses to accommodate for all of those things. Now the options, these are very important. So in this case, yes, only if an event designates a string input as a response, because what you're going to have, if you don't do this, you're going to see that every single event is going to have a text box. And that's going to be really, really kind of, it's going to catch your eye in a really weird way. You don't really want that. The display, this is kind of up to you. This is going to be the positioning of it. So this is going to be center on the x-axis and negative 200 pixels on the y-axis. And then almost, it's kind of a rectangle over here. Number of lines, you can have multiple lines. So they can just keep going down, down, down. Then the border, I gave it a box, or you can make the font size bigger. So I did that as well. Now response completion, again, this is another big one. By default, this is going to be after 3 seconds of inactivity. So if I said to you, what's your favorite color? And you went, if you took 3 seconds to answer, it would just think you completed the answer and move on. So we just leave it after 10 seconds because usually that's enough time to answer something. Then looking at if they press the return or enter key, what should you do? In this case, we're going to say that they've completed the response. Or you can say do nothing. Now you see this over here? This insert a new line character was grayed out. If I had made this part multiple lines, that would have been there. So then it would have just made a new entry for you. So that could be useful if you're looking at recalling several things. Sorry, the idea of saying list your 5 favorite foods, and they said, oh yeah, pizza, chicken, hamburger, whatever. They kept going down the list. That would record it in a way that would make you processing the data a little bit easier. But for right now, we're just going to be looking at just a single response for it. And we say, okay. Now looking at the events for them. Following events, write your text however the event instructs you to. Answer the question below, how are you feeling today? What do you see in the picture below? Possible answers is face or vase. And then a face. So before I show you the events, well actually before I show you the experiment, one thing that I want you to think about is, okay, how do you display text, and a picture at the same time. This is a setting in Superlab, and there's at least two different ways, I think, and each time it's always confusing because there's always something different to look at. But the key that I've seen, at least on the Superlab manual, is by doing two things. So when you're displaying just two things at the same time, in the input for the text, you're going to end this event immediately after the event is presented. So once it shows this text that says, "What do you see below?" From Superlab's standpoint, that event has already ended. As soon as it shows, it's over. But now what happens is the picture, the settings over here are enabled so that they're not going to erase the screen before presenting stimulus. In other words, whatever's on the screen before this was shown is going to stay there. That's useful pretty much only for showing multiple things, right? Because you wouldn't want to have everything from every other event on the screen still. So in this case, we're not going to erase the screen before, and that'll show us both of these simultaneously. And what that means, though, is because this event ends, this event can't collect a response. I'm sorry, this event can't collect a response. So we're going to have our response be in here, where it's going to be either of these choices, specific vase or specific face. So what I'll do is, again, I will run both of these at the same time. So run block. The following events, write your text however the event instructs you to. And again, you notice that because I made this decision to pretty much limit everything by just being a some input of whatever, we have to make sure that we actually use that. I'm going to skip ahead for a moment and just go to the mouse input instructions. I know it's going to be the same problem over there. Okay, fine. So now we run it. Answer the question below, how are you feeling today? Now notice how this box is not necessarily the most popped out box, right? For a question like this, you don't need a box this big. You can have it very, very small. Again, these open-ended questions, open-ended responses, one fault they have is that they're open-ended. So how are you feeling today? Am I looking for good or fine? Am I looking for, well, I've been better, you know, this climate right now is kind of terrible and going outside is scary and all these things. Or am I looking for okay, right? We didn't say that, we didn't really designate it, so we're not going to go too much into it, but we could just imagine that it's going to be good. Okay, press enter, and it recognizes that that is a response because we didn't tell it that it has to be this or that. Now we're seeing the picture below, possible answers are face or vase. Now again, in this case, I would imagine you could look at the order of this. So if you said vase first, do you see that first? I see the face all the time. Seeing the vase is very, very rare. So what you can see is if I say, oh yeah, you know what? Actually, I see a squiggle. No, you don't. If I see a lamb, it doesn't accept that as a response. So this person could be sitting here the whole time not getting this. This could also be if you showed them a math problem and they had to guess the answer. Until they got the answer correct, it wouldn't show them it. So we'll just say face, and the experiment ends. Now I'm going to just replay that again so I can show you that it works regardless of capitalization. Actually, it actually locks the caps lock, so that's fine. And then vase. Okay, cool. Now, lastly, going on to the mouse input. And again, think about the mouse input in a scenario in which you're asked to select one thing over another. If I showed you, let's say, well, in this case, it's gonna be money. So if it was some kind of task where I wanted you to choose some amount to take, this probably, and again, most of this is conjecture on my part because I've only used this. I've used this before in a flanker task experiment in which the participant had to choose a red or a green button, depending on what direction they thought that the arrow was facing. Or in that case, it was actually a fish. But the idea is that you want to give the person some autonomy in making this behavioral choice in actually navigating their mouse over to something and pressing a button. So before we look into that, again, what we'll do first is we'll look at the actual settings for it. So again, go into input, then look in the instructions for the mouse or touch screen, and we'll go to left first. So if we double click on left, it's going to say, this response consists of any mouse button being pressed. my keyboard, I'm using a Mac right now, and my keyboard is a touchpad, or a trackpad rather. So the idea is that I'm only using my left key anyways. So I'm gonna leave it as any mouse button for the moment, but you would probably change this to left button. Now this is the important thing you have to make sure you do. This is asking where is the position on the screen in which this response can be. Either one, anywhere on the screen, so anywhere you press is an acceptable response. Two, automatically determined by the position of the visual stimulus. So in other words, if I have a picture at negative 400x and positive 200y, it's going to assume that that picture, the whole entire dimensions of that picture, becomes your response box. You can do that, that's fine. Sometimes you want to have something a little bit more specific. That's what I did over here. So I made a specific area, found a location in pixels. And I said, okay, make it negative 400 pixels to the left, make it still in the center at Y, and make it 300 wide and 260 tall. Now, that's not arbitrary. I'll show you where that comes from in a moment. And if you look at right, you're going to see that pretty easily. This is just the exact opposite. So instead of negative 400x, it's positive 400x, because I want these two pictures to be here as opposed to here or whatever. Press OK. Now the options. After a mouse key is pressed, ignore the key release. Wait until the key is released. Again, look for input from mouse. Only if an event designates the mouse as the correct response. And then show mouse cursor and ignore a mouse click unless it falls inside an area defined as a response. You kind of want that checked off, especially if you've made if you say that yes, this part over here is where I want the choice to be, or response, but you wouldn't want them to click over here and have them advance, unless you were trying to say click on this thing for $100 and they missed it. And then data to save. I just took off everything over here. I'll say I'll probably enable this, the pixel position, in the way that the key was pressed or released. So this is, we want to see the X and Y location, because again, even within that space that you've defined, there still is going to be some variability or range in there. Then now looking at just the events for this, use your mouse to identify your response. Input any response participant. I'm going to say correct response, and the correct response is going to be the instruction advance. Feedback, there's no feedback here. In this case, we're using pictures of coins, and these coins I've taken from a Wikipedia article on different US currency, and I have just a dime, nickel, penny, and a quarter. And then in stimulus number 2, I've done the same exact thing using the same list, but in the settings what you're going to see is that this one is horizontally at 400 pixels to the right. I've made its size into a square, and I've done the same options that I did in the vase face event, where I've made this one the second image on screen, and this one I've made the first image on screen, but again, in the input, it's going to end as soon as it starts. Now this is an important thing to note, because what's going to happen is if I end this event immediately, mouse input 1, we'll call it, mouse input 1 cannot have a response, because by default it's ending as soon as it starts, so it can't have a response at all. So I have to make sure that in my mouse input 2 I have a correct response, and this correct response can be left or it can be right. That's very important, because if you don't do that, you're only going to see things on the right, and that's going to not be accurate reporting. There's no feedback here, so we'll just run through this. Following after user mouse to identify as response. Now I have a penny on my left and a nickel on my right. Okay, obviously if I had text up here that said which would you choose, we would see how fast they do it. Is there a preference between left and right? Whatever you wanted to look at. So if I press left, notice how it understands that this thing is over here. Now, when you're doing this, you want to get a transparent background or a white background so it blends in, so you don't see the border over there. But notice if I click over here, right, nothing is happening. And this is what you want to see. You don't want a response to be given if it's not in that area. So I can click on this penny over here. And now remember, the response box is kind of this invisible, I'll show you in a second. It's this invisible border over here. So if I click right over here, it'll still get it. Ideally though, because the images are so large, you would imagine the person should be clicking somewhere in here. Okay, so that ends. Now if I go to the instructions, for anything really, and I go to preview, you're gonna see these boxes. These boxes is that response area. So I could then make any event have that response area that I've designated to be left or right. So what I'll do is I'll just do a quick run through to look at the data, and then that'll be it for today's video. So if I do save collected data, I'm not gonna give myself a name for this, and then I'll just say, or I'll just save it as something else once it decides to load. Okay, cool. So it's gonna be my data file, and I'll just say test. Today's the 6th. Okay, so now stop sharing for a moment. I'll open up that text file. Just give me a moment. Using a new microphone, so I'm hoping that works a little bit better. So my data, and where was it? Test 4.6. Okay, open this up. Go to Excel. Give Excel a moment to load. One thing to note also that in Superlab, there is an option to save an experiment package. So the idea is that you could build an experiment and then you could save it and then send it to somebody else. That way you wouldn't have to kind of rebuild it from scratch each time. So I'll paste this data into, well, that's strange. It decided to paste everything in one column. So let me re-share, go to Excel. Okay, cool. And then what I'll do is just our usual of doing this. Get rid of this. And then again, this is kind of a little bit of formatting just to make things a little bit nicer to read. So what the response was, the key they pressed, the input. Now notice the input column does exist for every single thing, but it only has values in the string responses where it can be there. In the X and Y location, now looking at this, we have there's 4 pairings, there's 8 images, but there's 4 pairings. We have 4 values that tells us that, okay, this is good. And then the response they gave, whether it was, the correct response, again, everything over here is going to be over here. Now this one is self-correct and this one is error. So I have to go back and see why that's the case, but it's not really too important right now. Now looking over here, notice how on mouse input, it should be mouse input 1, honestly. The mouse input, every response it has is an error or a not correct response, or no response rather. Now the idea that's happening is because you cannot respond to an event that immediately ends when it's presented. And we want to see that what we did is we did left, right, left, right. So we see this left, right, left, right. Now notice the X and Y positions. They're not terribly different from each other, but not the same. And this is good because it tells us that even a location that's very, very far off from what it was before is still considered to be correct so long as it falls in that range or in that box that we've designated as being correct. This is what it could look like. This is the data that it stores over here. Now, we did run through this twice, so this actually should be here twice. Why it's not, I'm not sure. I think it's because it loops the block. I don't think it actually saves the looped events, but that's not really this video's purpose. And notice again that in this correct, it separates possible responses by a semicolon. So for this thing over here, there's two choices. It's double J, semicolon, double D. So it's saying that either of these choices is correct, which is important in the multiple choice one, where it has all of these as possibilities, and then saying, what did you actually choose? Oh yeah, MC3, that exists in this list, therefore it has to be correct. So that's looking at the different ways that you can have input in Superlab. The next video will be going over variability, looking at variable text, so things that could be different locations, different colors, all these things to kind of expand your knowledge of Superlab. And then what we'll be doing is we'll be taking data and going a little bit further into looking at some either analysis in either Excel or R. And yeah, we'll just see what happens then. All right, thank you.